Hello, I'm Roger Bisbee from the Skill Builder channel, and I want to talk about banks becoming landlords. Now, a few years ago, Lloyds Bank, which is actually the UK's largest mortgage provider, made a somewhat surprising move, which was to go into the private rented sector. They bought new build houses with the express intention of renting them out. In other words, they became buy-to-let landlords. It seems that they've built up their portfolio, adding to it year after year, and it now seems that other banks are going to follow their lead and also get into this business. Why are they doing this? Are they doing it out of the goodness of their corporate heart, or are they just in it to make money? In this video, I want to outline a few ideas that I have, but I also, as always, want to know what you think. Now, the first question I'd like to ask you is, do you think that this should be allowed, or do you think there should be a law against it? Because obviously if the banks, not just one bank, but several banks are buying up vast housing estates of new builds, they're actually removing those from the open market and making it harder for other people to buy them. Everybody knows the laws of supply and demand, and if you remove things from the market, obviously the price goes up. And if you happen to be a big player in the mortgage market, then having high house prices is no bad thing. High house prices and high interest rates is a marriage made in heaven, if you're a lender. But is it all bad news for those looking to buy or rent a home? Because you're going to have shared ownership packages where the bank owns a bit and you own a bit, and it may actually help people to get a foot on the ladder. Whereas if you're going with a private landlord, those kind of schemes are just not available. Now, years ago, we used to have what they now call social housing. We used to call it council housing. And these were vast estates of council houses. I grew up in one, many other people did. And one of the features of these council houses is that you had security of tenure. In other words, so long as you behaved yourself and you paid your rent, you weren't going to get chucked out, which is not the case with private landlords. Now, this had a great social benefit because it gave people stability. I mean, if you're now private renting, at any time the landlord could decide to sell the property and turf you out through no fault of your own. So having this kind of security meant that families could grow, they could flourish, and hopefully they could improve their lot over the years. Now, one thing that happened is that Margaret Thatcher decided that what they ought to be able to do is buy these houses that they were living in. And of course that was a great thing, because suddenly we had this property owning democracy. The people were moving towards middle class. The ghettos of council estates were suddenly half owned by private people, half owned by the council, and those people were more likely to vote Tory and less likely to go on strike, because after all they had a mortgage to pay. As always with Margaret Thatcher, there was an agenda. And I think the great injustice in all this was that those receipts from the sale of those council houses were not put back into building more homes. And of course, with a rising population, that has created a scarcity, and a scarcity, as I said before, means higher prices. Higher prices, if you happen to be a homeowner, may be a good thing. It means that you can sell that council house and bugger off to Spain. But for anybody looking to get the foot on the ladder, for any young person looking to buy a home, house prices mean that they're even further away from being able to afford their first place. So if you can't afford to buy, what are you going to do? You've got to rent. And if you're renting from private landlords, we go back to this thing of not having security of tenure. So what started out as a good idea with the best of intentions has ended up being something of a disaster. A great many of those former council houses are now owned by private landlords. And because the rents are high, both people in the house may be working, they still can't afford to pay the rents without some kind of income support. And of course, if people aren't working, that means the taxpayer is picking up the whole bill for the rent on these houses. Now, I don't want to demonise private landlords, because some of them are good, but by no means all of them. And naturally, all of them are looking to maximise their yield. They're looking for a profit out of this. And one way to improve your profits is to keep your overheads low. In other words, don't carry out any repairs on the property, any decoration or anything like that, unless you're forced to by legislation. Now, it's fair to say that the bottom has finally fallen out of the private rental sector, and a lot of those people who had buy-to-lets are getting out of there as fast as they possibly can, because the government is putting putting more onerous restrictions on them. The tax breaks that they previously enjoyed have now gone, and they've got to pay tax on all of the income, not just on their profits. And they've also got to upgrade those properties in terms of energy efficiency, and they've got to achieve a minimum standard of E. A being the best standard of energy efficiency, E is a long way down the scale. It's not nothing, but it's not great. And the government has also been a little bit generous to landlords in saying that you will not have to spend any more than £3,500 on doing up a property to make it more energy efficient. Now, £3,500 doesn't go a long way. It's not going to get you all new doors and windows in many houses, and it's just about going to get you a new boiler. But because they've put this cap on it, it means that landlords can now show a receipt for £3,500 that they got from their friendly builder to say that they've spent that money on loft insulation, whatever, and that is the limit of their obligation. So if all those landlords are getting out of the private rented sector, why are the banks getting into it? Well, the banks aren't stupid. They're not buying up those drafty old dilapidated properties with rising damp. They're buying up the new builds. And new builds mean that they've already achieved those energy standards, and they won't have rising damp, and hopefully they won't have a lot of the other problems that you get with older houses. And I would say that they're still going to have mold problems because, as we all know, new builds are nicely draft proofed and sealed up, and when you start getting tenants in there who don't understand that you need a bit of ventilation and you need to heat the home, then you're going to get problems. So watch out, banks, it's coming your way. But I think it's fair to say that on balance, those new build properties are going to be a better investment for the bank, because banks tend to like copper bottom blue chip investments. And it means that when they've got those kind of assets, they can also attract more investment. They can go to the pension companies and say, would you like to buy shares in our new property company? We've got all these lovely new homes and we've got all these tenants in there, and what's not to like about that? I mean, if you're paying into a pension fund, you may be strangely comforted by the fact that that money is going into bricks and mortar or whatever they're building houses of now. And the banks are going to want to maximise their profits. The pension companies are going to want to see a return on that. And that means that as house prices go up, rents will go up. And without any effective control on rents, we are at the mercy of these banks and these other big institutions. I'm fully aware that there'll be people in Germany and places like Sweden who will be watching this video and thinking, what's all the fuss about? In our countries, people don't own their properties. They rent properties for their whole life. We don't have this obsession with a property owning population. We're quite happy to rent because those properties are owned by pension companies and we pay our rents, and that money goes into our pensions, and when we retire we've got a lovely income which is basically being paid by other people paying rents. Whereas in the UK we spend our entire working life paying off these mortgages, paying off the interest, and eventually paying off the capital, and at the end of our working life we're sitting on an asset which is worth quite a lot of money. But of course we've got to live in it, or we've got to sell it, or we've got to take equity release, or equity fleece as I call it. And if you do happen to hang on to that property till you die and you want to pass it on to your kids so that maybe they can get on the property ladder, or even your grandchildren, inheritance tax kicks in. And that's why we're one of the highest taxed countries in the whole world, because you pay tax when you earn the money, spend the money, and what money you don't spend you will eventually pay tax on when you die. Well, obviously not all of it, but given the fact that property prices have risen so much, a lot of people now find themselves in that inheritance tax band, even though they're not what we might call millionaires. But when you put all these issues aside, I suppose the fundamental question is, do you trust banks to be a landlord? I mean, given the fact that banks are now even harder, I mean, they're disappearing. At one time they were in the high street, now they're all disappearing. I don't even know where my bank is anymore. It's on a computer. And if you've got a problem with your property, you're probably going to experience the same kind of frustration you do when you try to get hold of your bank. In other words, an endless line of recorded messages before you ever get to speak to a human being. And then that human being may be on the other side of the world and barely intelligible. And if you don't trust the banks to be a landlord, you don't trust these property companies, then you're probably looking to the government to offer you some protection as a private renter. But governments have a very bad track record of protecting the electorate and protecting consumers. Whatever they do in the way of new legislation usually turns out to be a complete disaster. They're very good at making cock-ups and they're very good at losing taxpayers' money. Strangely, when it comes to their own investments, they're not quite so inept. I mean, if we take that great socialist Tony Blair, he's estimated to have a property portfolio of around £30 million, and his kids and his wife aren't doing badly either. Now, Tony Blair is just about the same age as I am, and if I had £30 million, I would have to develop some very expensive habits to get rid of that by the time I croak. But of course I could leave that to my kids, but 30 million quid, that's going to be a lot of inheritance tax. I wonder if Tony's thought of that. I wonder if he's got a scheme for avoiding that, like a trust or something. But I fully admit that I'm one of the lucky people who was born at the right time and could afford to buy a home when it was doable. And although we thought it was a lot of money at the time and we did scrimp and save, actually when you look at it now, it turned out to be a very good investment. When I bought my first house, the interest rates were actually 15%, but that meant that house prices were lower. And as interest rates went down, house prices went up. And the other thing that I think was a total disaster was the Help to Buy scheme, because as those prices went up, the government decided that people needed a little bit of help from the taxpayer to get them on the property ladder. But all that did is to push prices up even more and shovel even more taxpayers' money into the pockets of the big house builders. And what did the house builders do with that money? Well, they bought more land. They bought every bit of land they could find, anything that looked like it could be built on. They snaffled up, and they're sitting on these vast packages of land, or packets of land as they sometimes call them, and they're not building on them all because they can see the prices go up and they don't want to be busy fools. They build enough, just enough, keep the house prices high, don't build too many so that the house prices go down. So in that way they're helping to control the market, and when they do eventually decide to build on that land and they sell it, they're going to have ready-made cash buyers in the form of the banks. So why would you want to sell to anybody else? I mean, all those people in a chain, all that messy business, and all those people coming around kicking the bricks before they buy. You don't want any of that. You've got 250 brand new homes to sell, and you've got a bank ready with the wonga to buy them. I rest my case.